June 22, 1940. A warm summer sun hung over Europe, but the continent felt frozen, breathless, suspended between disbelief and dread. The once mighty French army, the same army the world believed was the strongest on earth, had collapsed in just 6 weeks under Hitler's blitzkrieg. And in London, in a room thick with cigarette smoke and urgency, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the message that would reshape the fate of the world. France had surrendered. Across Europe, radios crackled with the announcement. Families gathered in silence. Soldiers stared in disbelief. Governments panicked. Hitler celebrated. And Britain, now utterly alone, braced for the storm that was coming. But what did Churchill say in that moment? What did he tell his cabinet, his generals, his people, and perhaps more revealingly, himself, when France fell? This is the story of Churchill's reaction when the last barrier between Britain and Nazi domination collapsed, and the world waited to see whether he would stand firm or make peace. To understand Churchill's reaction, we must understand the scale of the collapse. France's defeat wasn't expected, not by the French, not by the Germans, and certainly not by the British. For 20 years after the First World War, France had invested everything, money, pride, strategy, into preventing another German invasion. The Maginot Line was hailed as an unbreakable wall, a monument to military engineering. French generals were confident. The French public was reassured. Even Hitler had doubts about whether his army could defeat France. And then, in May 1940, it took just 46 days. French armies were encircled, cities overrun. Refugees flooded the roads by the millions. Paris fell without a fight. And by mid-June, the French government fled toward Bordeaux in desperation. When Churchill heard that France was requesting terms from Hitler, he immediately understood the consequences. Britain would now stand alone against the most powerful war machine ever assembled. He sent a message urging the French to keep fighting, even encouraging them to move their government to North Africa and continue the war from there. But Churchill privately knew the truth. France was finished. And when the official word came that France had signed the armistice, Churchill removed his glasses, leaned back in his chair, and whispered the words history would later remember. The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Public speeches are polished, carefully crafted, meant for morale. But the words Churchill spoke in private were different, raw, unfiltered, and heavy with the weight of a nation's survival. The moment the news was confirmed, Churchill gathered his war cabinet. The room was tense, the atmosphere electric with fear. Some ministers still hoped that peace with Germany might be possible. Some believed Britain could not stand alone. Some wanted to negotiate before it was too late. Churchill looked at them one by one. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. He simply said, "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." There was silence. In that moment, Churchill had drawn a line through history. There would be no negotiation. No surrender, no compromise. Britain would fight on, with or without allies. He later told his private secretary, "I cannot believe. I will not believe that God created such a great nation in order for it to be destroyed." These weren't words of arrogance. They were words of defiance, of resolve, of a man who knew that his country's survival now depended entirely on the will of its people and his ability to inspire them. The day France surrendered, Churchill addressed the British nation. Millions listened at their radios, in kitchens, in bomb shelters, in pubs, on factory floors. The empire listened, the world listened. And Churchill gave them something they desperately needed. Not comfort, not reassurance, but truth paired with hope. He told them, "The collapse of France fills us with sorrow, and also with a sense of dread." He didn't hide the fear. He didn't pretend the situation was manageable. He didn't disguise the fact that Britain was now alone. But then came the words people would never forget. "Hitler knows he must break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands." Broad, sunlit uplands. A phrase that captured the paradise on the far side of suffering, a future worth fighting for. He continued, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.' These words weren't meant to inspire peace but resistance. They became the anthem of a nation preparing to fight alone against the storm. Public bravado is one thing, private doubt is another. After delivering his broadcast, Churchill returned to his office. For the first time in the war, one of his advisors noticed something unusual. Churchill was quiet. He walked to the window, looked out over the darkened city, and said softly, "I wonder how it will all end." He knew what was coming: the Luftwaffe, the bombings, the attempted invasion, the months of terror, the possibility of collapse. Britain was outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched in the air. Hitler was preparing Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles, and Churchill understood the stakes with absolute clarity. If Britain fell, the war was over. If Britain fell, democracy was over. If Britain fell, the world was Hitler's. But in that same quiet moment, he made a promise to himself, one he never wrote down, one he never said publicly, but one he lived out every day of the war. I will never be the one who gives the order to surrender. He would rather see Britain reduced to ashes than enslaved. This was the real Churchill, a man terrified, exhausted, overwhelmed, but unbreakable. France had fallen. Belgium had fallen. Norway had fallen. The Netherlands had fallen. Poland had fallen. Czechoslovakia had fallen. Every nation that had stood against Hitler, except one, had been defeated. For the people of occupied Europe, Churchill became something more than a leader. He became a symbol. In Paris cafes operating in secret, people whispered his name. In Warsaw, prisoners carved it into cell walls. In Belgium, underground papers printed his speeches. In the Netherlands, families gathered around hidden radios to listen in the dark. Churchill's defiance told them something no army could. All is not lost. Britain still fights. Resistance still lives. But most importantly, his refusal to negotiate sent a message to Hitler that the dictator did not want to hear. Britain would not break. The surrender of France was supposed to make Britain collapse. Instead, Churchill's words rallied the British Empire, and even America, which was still officially neutral, took notice. President Franklin Roosevelt wrote to him, "If Britain stands, we shall not let her fall." Churchill later said that this message brought him the first deep sleep I had enjoyed since the war began. And so, while the fall of France marked the lowest point of the war for Britain, it also marked the beginning of something else: the rise of Churchill as the voice of freedom in a world going dark. Just days after France's surrender, German reconnaissance aircraft appeared over the English coast. Soon, British radar stations lit up with incoming raids. The Luftwaffe was preparing its assault. That night, Churchill met with RAF commanders. They spoke frankly about Britain's odds. The RAF was brave, but small. The Luftwaffe was vast, experienced, and flying from runways only minutes away in French territory. One commander warned that if losses were too heavy, the RAF might not be able to defend the country. Churchill listened quietly, then replied, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much depended upon so few." He would repeat this line famously months later. But it was born in this first moment, when the French collapse had forced Britain to rely on the thin shield of its fighter pilots. He closed the meeting by saying, "We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be, and we shall never surrender." These words were not for speeches. They were for the men who would soon fight for the sky above Britain. And they understood exactly what he meant. Stand your ground, hold the line, because you are now the only ones left. Years later, in his memoirs, Churchill wrote about the day France surrendered. His words reveal more emotion than he ever showed publicly. "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial." He understood the enormity of the moment. He understood that history had placed the responsibility of Western civilization on his shoulders. And he understood that France's fall was not the end of the war, but the beginning of Britain's greatest test. In a private note, written late at night on June 22nd, he summed up his belief with chilling clarity: "If Britain falls, all falls." But then, as if answering his own fear, he added a second line, "But we shall not fall." When France surrendered in 1940, the world expected Britain to follow. Hitler expected it, the German High Command expected it. Even many in Churchill's own government expected it. But Churchill refused. His words, spoken in cabinet rooms, broadcast to the nation, whispered to himself, carried a power far greater than armies or tanks. They kept Britain fighting. They kept Europe hoping. they kept freedom alive. And because Britain did not fall, Hitler turned east, toward the Soviet Union. Because Britain did not fall, America found time to rearm. Because Britain did not fall, the Allies eventually returned to Europe on the beaches of Normandy. The world that came after the war, the free world, exists in part because of Churchill's reaction on the day France surrendered. So what did Churchill say when he learned France had fallen? He said words that changed history. The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. And from that moment forward, he fought for victory, alone, if necessary, until the world was free again.